Ringo shows back up. He listens to Jim Gordon play, and they hand him a tambourine. And Ringo's fine with that. Fine with that. By the end of the sessions, they were playing double drums together.
We are up to our entire interview with Joe Sullivan, and the book is called Drums and Demons, and this book is captivating. Whenever I put something up on Jim Gordon, it always does incredibly well because people are still wondering why. Why did he take his mother's life? Well, he had undiagnosed, as far as we know, schizophrenia, which started possibly in the late 60s, early 70s, and he heard voices, his mother's voice. I'd read transcripts where people were saying that he had said, "The only way you'll get rid of my voice in your head is if you do me away." When Jim Gordon was in prison for taking his mother's life, he didn't want any visitors. When I talked to Jeff Skunk Baxter, who was in Steely Dan with him, played with Steely Dan, he said, "I'd like to visit him, but I don't think Jeff at the time knew that he wasn't taking any visitors at all." We talk about so many things in this long clip. The Beach Boys, God Only Knows, Good Vibrations, Smiley Smile, Pet Sounds, You're So Vain, Carly Simon, how weird circumstances had Jim Gordon in town for one night with Frank Zappa end up drumming on that when Richard Perry says, "Get over here." Carly Simon didn't want to see Frank Zappa. The three most important people in Jim Gordon's life: Jill Gordon, his ex-wife, Amy, his daughter, and composer Mike Post, who gave us all those great soundtracks. And what they said, looking back at Jim now, since he passed away in 2023 in jail, the weird circumstances surround someone who's got undiagnosed schizophrenia, who takes his mother's life. A man who played on so many great records. We talk about that and a lot more on Rock History Music. Jim Gordon was a professional drummer, born July 14th, 1945. He was famous for being a very popular session musician and was known as a protege to drumming legend Hal Blaine. He played on some classic albums, like the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. He was in studio with Paul Revere and the Raiders, as well as the Byrds and Judy Collins, and Frank Zappa. In 1970, he was part of Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishman tour. He also toured with Traffic and was on 2 of their albums, including Low Spark of High Heel Boys. He was featured on Harry Nilsson's famous Nilsson Schmilsson. There was also Johnny Rivers, Art Garfunkel. Let's not forget he was on Steely Dan's album Pretzel Logic featuring Ricky Don't Lose That Number, and a few tracks on Alice Cooper's 1976 album Alice Cooper Goes to Hell. Gordon was one of the most prolific session drummers of the 1960s and 70s. He was known for his incredible versatility and, as mentioned, famous for playing on some of the biggest songs of those decades. He was born in Los Angeles and began drumming professionally as a teenager. He became a key figure in the Wrecking Crew group, the not-so-famous musicians who played on very famous hits. Let's revisit some of those hits. Layla with Derek and the Dominos. He was part of that band on their one and only studio album. Though he's given a co-write to Layla, there's a lot of conflicting stories that the piano coda in that song was actually written by Rita Coolidge. Then there's You're So Vain by Carly Simon. His drummings really featured prominently on that 1972 hit that topped the charts in both the US and the UK. One of the most impressive guitar hits of all time has to be Classical Gas by Mason Williams. It's an instrumental, came out in '68, and was one of Gordon's early claims to fame. On that track, nothing but finesse drumming. As mentioned, Ricky Don't Lose That Number by Steely Dan. There was Wichita Lineman by Glenn Campbell, that famous Jimmy Webb song from '68. Again, very subtle drumming, yet essential for that ballad. It's known as one of the greatest country songs of all time. And the Albert Hammond hit from '72, It Never Rains in Southern California. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention one of the greatest post-Beatle albums of all time by any member of that band, All Things Must Pass, with George Harrison, 1970. There was a dark side to Jim Gordon's life. In the 70s, possibly as early as the 60s, he started hearing voices, most notably his mother's voice. And eventually his condition worsened. Tragically, in 1983, he took his mother's life. He was convicted and sentenced to 16 years to life, though he stayed there for the rest of his life. He passed away in prison on March 13th, 2023. Though there are conflicting stories, it seems his schizophrenia was undiagnosed at the time of the crime. Jim Gordon, one of the greatest drummers of all time, and unfortunately overshadowed by that awful crime involving his mother. He met McCartney in England,
When he was with the Everly Brothers.
Yeah. That was an
Well,
interesting
the Everly
time
Brothers
when
were
you
rock
sit
and roll royalty in 1963.
Yeah.
And in England, that was a prominent position, being the Early Brothers drummer. So yeah, McCartney came up to him in a nightclub and introduced himself.
I like the fact that Ringo, of course, understood, uh, uh, had a lot of praise for him as well.
Yeah, well, and Charlie Watts knew him on the first English tour of the Rolling Stones. So they'd never heard drummers like that in England. Jim shows up there in what, '69 with the Delaney and Bonnie thing, and nobody ever heard anything like that. Uh, when they went into do the George Harrison sessions, they'd already been ongoing, and Ringo had been playing drums, but he had to leave town for a couple weeks, do some sessions in Nashville, I think. And when he came back, the Jim was behind the kid. I mean, the first thing Jim cut with Harrison was "What Is Life," and you think about the intro of that song. I mean, Jim just explodes into
Yeah.
George Harrison's music, just takes command of it right from the first downbeat, and so Ringo shows back up. He listens to Jim Gordon play, and they hand him a tambourine. And Ringo was fine with that. Fine with that. By the end of the sessions, they were playing double drums together. One of those jam sessions is Jim and Ringo back and forth. And Ringo's a great drummer, so he's in a perfect position to understand how extraordinary Jim's skills are. Drummers are. Other people, I mean, they can't quite like dial that in. But once you start paying attention to what Jim does, you realize that he plays way beyond notation. He has a level of intuition that other drummers can't match. It's not just the technical ability, which he's got up the yin yang, it's the compositional brain, his ability to see drums as a whole instrument, as a part of an arrangement, and to make everything bigger, not just the drum part. I love, well, we mentioned You're So Vain, but My Maria by B.W. Stevenson, that's just amazing what he does with that. Or Grazing in the Grass by the Friends of Distinction. He's a freight train on that. Yet on the other hand, you can go to something like Midnight at the Oasis, where he just came in and listened to the material. He was working with Lenny Waronker as the producer, and Lenny knew to let him go. And he dreamed up this samba beat. And the other guys on the session weren't really session musicians. They were folk guys that were friends of Maria's. And Jim just drove that whole session. And if you ask me, it wouldn't have been a hit record without that.
Yeah.
And reeling in not reeling in the years, but Ricky, Don't Lose That Number. He saw what they were doing with the melody on that, which was borrowing something from a famous jazz record by the Horace Silver Quintet, and he just went right into his Horace Silver bag, crossed a hand and all that. And again, that was the big hit record for Steely Dan.
I got to start by telling you something. I've never read your work before, but sir, holy snapping turtles, you're a great writer.
Well, thank you. Can't hear that too often.
I like that. Well, I'm surprised. I like, what I really liked about the book? I love the way you had me from you like talking about, the latter part of his life first with the Blue Monkeys. That you got me. You're like, I mean, obviously I'm a drummer. I'm a 41-year broadcaster. I've talked to many people who knew the guy through the years. It comes up all the time. David Paich went on about a big thing about him too. And it's one of those captivating things. How long has this been? Let's start here. How long has this been in the works for you?
I spent 4 years on it.
Yeah. So how far back in your life were you consciously aware of him, Jim Gordon?
Oh, Delaney and Bonnie. I don't think I knew about him as a session musician, but Delaney and Bonnie had a huge impact on people who were paying attention in 1969. They were just an incredible band. I saw them at the Santa Monica Civic, and Yeah, and then goes right into Mad Dogs and Englishmen, which was a tour that everybody noticed at that time. So Jim Gordon was a figure of repute from that point on. Derek and the Dominos just sort of sealed that deal, right?
When I was talking to Dave Mason, talked about Delaney and Bonnie, of course, and playing with, of course, the daughter and in the reinvited Fleetwood Mac. But he had told me something before we go on. He says the world. I'm so surprised that the world, the people who should know about Delaney and Bonnie don't. He says that bothers me.
Well, they didn't have a hit record, and they had an incompetent manager, Alan Pariser, who was a hipster pot dealer, and they were in the engine room of Leon Russell scheming and thinking about how to get out of the studios, and Delaney Bramlett, who was pretty much in the grips of drugs and alcohol abuse. So they didn't have like that focused leadership. I don't think the records were quite up to speed. I mean, the singles. There's a couple of singles on Atco that come close, but they had problems with Elektra. They had an album in the can at Stax. They moved to Atco. I mean, they really weren't a commercially viable. But the band, oh my God, what an incredible band! The Rhino Handmade outfit put out a 4-5 CD box set of all the European tour recordings, and that's the thing they made the on tour album out of. But this is just the raw stock, recorded by Andy Johns, and my gosh, are those strong shows, and the band just kills everything. So, yeah, I'm with Dave. I don't know what happened there. But those of us who were paying attention at the time certainly knew about it.
Fly in the wall aspect of the book to me, when you started it off, it's strange. I always see him. I'm up here and I'm looking at him as you're describing this guy, this quiet drummer who's not dropping names, but as I think, I don't know, I forget who you were saying. He said, "Oh, that's me playing on one of the tracks." He had heard it on the radio on one of the guys from Blue Monkeys, and the fact that out of nowhere he says, "Well, I got to go. I got to go to the doctor," and he's never seen again. And then the incident happens. And how did you see him when you were describing him? Who was that guy that you were describing near the end with the Blue Monkeys?
Yeah, that opening scene is powerful in my mind too, John. It's there's some of the genesis of my interest in this came from that. Because I knew Rolly Sally in the Chris Isaak band real well. He was a good friend, and he told me long ago about playing with Jim Gordon, and I found that so interesting that Jim Gordon was in this dump band that because he couldn't manage himself. And yeah, Rolly was sweet. Rolly sent him a bathrobe when he was in jail. You don't get to wear bathrobes in jail.
Oh my God. Jeff Skunk Baxter told me, it might have been the first time I talked to him, might have been about 6 months before Jim died. And he said, well, I should visit him. And the second time was just a few weeks after he died. And I said, you weren't going to visit him. I mean, you know that. I don't have to tell you anything, right? He says, oh, yeah. And then I was watching one of your interviews earlier with another guy named John, the drummer. And you had said that you sent Jim Gordon some books. And he obviously got them, but he was not the type of guy that was going to reach out to you.
He didn't like visitors.
Yeah.
He didn't want them. I don't want to say he was happy or comfortable, but Jim accepted imprisonment as his life. He didn't play drums in prison. And he'd sit in with the prison band every so often because everybody knew who he was, but he wasn't regularly on the drums. He didn't want to play drums. He didn't want to think about that part of his life. He was heavily medicated. He was, still very ill. And I think he avoided all his parole hearings. Um, so I think Jim embraced prison as the solution for his problems. And there's a number of people who told me, that they tried to make arrangements to visit him and that he would cancel at the last minute. This also, by the way, is kind of typical of late stage schizophrenics. I mean, schizophrenics have huge problems bonding with people. It was really difficult for Jim to be a father or to be in a romantic relationship. And all the studio musicians that worked by his side, they didn't have any real personal knowledge of him. They knew him as a musician and a guy with a smile. But I'm talking to Dean Parks, 100 sessions or more with Jim, and he didn't know whether Jim was married or had kids, or they'd never had a lunch together or a drink after the sessions. But that's schizophrenics for you. They do not bond. And as they get older, they get more and more, in interior life and withdrawn. So that's what people describe Jim on the Yard is remote, by himself, not on the yard a lot. Most of his time spent in his cell. It's heartbreaking stuff. It really is.
Well, you had mentioned in the book the very nature. I mean, the thing that made him mad also made him brilliant. That's my words, not yours. I'm not sure how you put it. I've got it on my notes here someplace, but that's interesting. But it's also that statement itself is brilliant. Of course it is. Everyone knows someone with schizophrenia, everybody. And if you put it that way to them, they'll go.
Yeah, and the other part of it is that when he played drums, I'm pretty convinced that he shut out the disease. That you're a drummer, you know what it feels like to drum. It's encompassing between the rhythmic entrainment, the hypnotic power of the mighty groove, and
the spirit. Every men's group has a drum. Every men's group drum. This is spiritual.
The report of the drums, right? I mean, it fills your whole body. So I think that when Jim played drums, he was well. He was whole. He was in command of his life. He was in charge. He was on top of the world. And then when he stopped playing drums, it all just flooded back.
If you had a chance to talk to him, I mean, it's a weird question to ask you because, first of all, you're going to go there and we guide our questions and our communication based on who we are, but also what we see. What do you think you would have asked him?
I wouldn't have gone to an interview with Jim Gordon looking for him to give me factual details of his life, and to recollect specific things. That would be asking a lot of that personality. In an interview situation like that, I'd want to take the temperature of the interview subject. I'd want to see where he is comfortable going. I wanted to test the strengths of his recollections, what his interest is, what he feels good talking about, and then go there. I don't think I would look for details of sessions or questions about relationships. He did an interview about 6 months before he went to jail with Modern Drummer, and it's out there on the internet. The guy posted the tape.
I heard it this morning. It's
really lucid Jim, right? I mean, he sounds absolutely together. He's totally there, but he doesn't mention another human being. All he talks about is playing drums, and he's quite articulate about it. Willing to go all the way under the hood, and he knows exactly what size cymbals, exactly what drum heads he uses, how he employs paradiddles. I mean, it's a fantastic interview. But again, he never mentions another human being.
You're one of those guys that can get into doors because you know your stuff. You've been doing this an awful long time. What advice would you give someone who's in the industry? We'll get back to Jim in a second, but you seem comfortable in your skin in the way that you're one of the guys, because you are.
Well, I worked as the daily newspaper guy, right? And I was the pop music guy for the San Francisco Chronicle. So I had a job, and my job was to go and watch the shows. But listen, it was important because those halls only held so many people, and bands would come through town, and unless I was there to write about it in the newspaper, nobody knew they were there. So it was a big deal. I mean, later on in the internet and stuff like that, it definitely made the daily newspaper less important. But all through the 70s and 80s and 90s, that's how you found out about this stuff. So I had a role to play. Some goofy friend of mine ended up directing and writing a TV series, and he cast me as a part to play in one scene, and I was to play a rock critic. Okay. So I went down, and the first thing they did was send me to wardrobe. And the gals in wardrobe looked at me and said, "You're fine."
The first thing I thought when I was watching interviews of you, I'm going back and forth through the book and watching interviews of you, I'm going, David Page says that. Oh my God, it's so hard to be fans with to be sort of quasi-friendly with a guy who might be a fan of the band, because they're such fanboys. And as he says, it's really nice, but sometimes I have interest in someone. I'm going, that guy's really interesting. I just wish he wasn't a fanboy, because he's a really interesting guy.
Still, let me tell you, they like talking about themselves, and they like talking about their music, and they're perfectly comfortable being who they are and expounding on that. So
you've said about Jim that You're So Vain is like one of his greatest pieces of all time. And it's interesting, Andy Newmark, younger at that time, was able to think on conscious or unconscious, a good idea is a good idea no matter where it came from, and just kind of use it as a learning session, as you said before.
I think that's Andy's character. Andy was the first person I spoke to about on this book. And I talked to Andy when I was trying to research the proposal, because he has an account of playing that session out on the internet, and I read that and contacted him and talked to him about it. And he's just a very studious, straightforward, down-to-earth guy. I think that's just in his character, to see this as a learning opportunity, not as a job he lost. But he'd already watched some other guy cut the drum track that he did the first time. Some British session player came in and took a crack at it. And the fact is, that's a masterpiece drum part. What Jim did, I don't think other people could have done. It is something that bespeaks the Jim Gordon's four drum style, as opposed to like Hal Blaine Monster Kid or something. He gets all that thunder out of four drums, right? Amazing. And the approach is so, how you want to say, compositional. Okay, it's not a drum part. It is a piece of the composition. It serves the whole piece. And yeah, it's a great scene in the book, thanks to Andy Newmark, because Jim came in after two people had tried it. They'd been working on this track a week. He comes in, and in one night, 60 takes, 4 hours, he puts this thing on the top of the charts, and everybody knew it. And it's a real sort of heroic moment for Jim. But it survives. I mean, that record wouldn't be what it is without the drum part. And Perry knew that. Richard Perry, the producer, he knew that.
David Henschel told me something about Richard Perry. He says, called him a mad genius, of course. And you always have this picture of Richard Perry in front of a Studer or something, and having like a whole bunch of different, and he knows every one of the takes that's over his shoulder or something. I'm not saying that happened, but people have this mad genius look at Richard Perry. He says, Henschel said, he says, oh, the guy drove me crazy, but he was genius.
Perry was one of the first of the super obsessive producers that would drive artists into the 60, 70, 80 takes. I mean, he pulled Harry Nilsson by the nose through Without You. And I think it's like about 80 takes. And the finished vocal, which is clearly obviously a composite of like I don't know how many parts, but it's an impossible vocal. It does things that you couldn't do if you were actually just singing it. And Harry hated the song too, by the way. And so that was all Perry just seeing. And here's Harry Nilsson, who was this brilliant undiscovered artist who had a series of albums that everybody loved, but nobody had heard of him until Richard Perry made him sing Without You.
So was it Richard Perry who said he didn't dig the drums that were being put on You're So Vain, and then Jim Gordon's in town with Zappa for one night?
Yep. Called up to say hi, and Perry says, "What are you doing? Come down here right now."
And is it true Carly she thought the song was finished and she saw Zappa came in too?
Yeah, Zappa came along to accompany Jim and just hang out for a little bit. I don't think he was there for long. But Carly Simon comes in and she thinks the track is done. She thinks they're finished with it. And she comes in and sees Jim Gordon and Frank Zappa, and she has a hissy fit. And Perry had to take her aside, and she cried and yelled and held her breath. But Perry wasn't impressed. He was going to get Jim Gordon to cut these drum tracks.
You mentioned Skip Spence in the book Moby Grape, and I just talked to Peter Lewis a little while ago, and he tell these most amazing stories. But with Skip, everyone's interested in this Peter Green, Fleetwood Mac, Skip Spence. I can't write enough about Syd Barrett because it just there's always a crowd for it. But there's this. What do you think it is? The longing for the curiosity of madness in music.
Madness and art. I mean, Van Gogh.
Yep.
He was probably schizophrenic too. The combination of those things has always been a volatile deal of people who have mental illness, that their brain chemistry is entirely different than what so-called normal people are. And then you factor in the enterprise of creativity. So they have a different sphere that they're operating in. And there's no doubt that those things are related, and it's tortured a lot of people. I mean, the whole life of Charlie Parker is a perfect example. He was a musical genius who saw around corners, and as a human being, he suffered tremendously from mental illness and an inability to relate to other people.
When I was younger, I remember someone introduced me to Bill Evans, the piano player, the other guy. And I remember I liked it because I used to have a recording 8-track. I could record on an 8-track machine, those old pieces of crap. But I found the Bill Evans Live in Japan was the longest 8-track you could buy. So I'd go, I'm going to record over this. And one day I thought, I think I'm just going to listen to this. I mean, I keep buying I buy 5 versions of this deleted 8-track. And I finally listened to him. And of course, people started telling me about him and his problems and the dual diagnosis that these people have, right? They're dealing with this, but they self-medicate with this. And it's a fascinating thing. I mean, it's all over jazz.
I knew Evans' record producer, Orrin Keepnews, real well. And
really?
Orrin was a wonderful guy. And there was nothing more fun than taking Orrin to lunch and saying, Thelonious Monk, and then a half hour later saying, John Coltrane. I mean, but he and what the thing that fascinated Warren was the secret Bill Evans tapes. Do you know about those?
No.
So some guy made a hobby of recording Bill Evans without Bill Evans knowing it. He had a suitcase with a microphone built into it, and he would go to New York nightclubs and he would record Bill Evans without anybody knowing it. Well, see, Bill Evans was super self-conscious. And if he knew he was being recorded, his playing style changed completely. And so Oren found these tapes. The guy brought them to Oren, and he flipped because this was the raw, naked Bill Evans that he could never record, that he could never get on tape. He put out a CD box set called The Secret Bill Evans Tapes. So, I mean, to me, I'm my ear isn't tuned in enough. I mean, I listen to them and they're great, but I mean, I don't see the distinction that Oren did between, like, say, Jazz on a Sunday Afternoon and this stuff. Uh, on the other hand, it just goes to show what how goofy this guy was. That the red light made him change his whole approach to playing.
Jill. So are you saying that Jill did not want to be part of this, but she wished you luck?
When I started work on the book, I reached out to Mike Post, who is Amy Gordon's godfather and Jill Gordon's closest friend. And I told him I was going to do this book. And he gave it authentic, serious consideration. But in the long run, he wasn't there. He called up and he said, I really wish you luck and everything, but no, there's no upside to this for us. So I went ahead and did the book without the talking to Mike or Jill or Amy, and then finished the manuscript, and I sent it into the publisher and took a vacation. And the first morning I was in Hawaii, the phone rings, and it's Mike Post. And he says that Jim has died and that the family wants to put out a release to get ahead of the story, but they don't really know how to. And he suggested that I might. Well, indeed, I do, have a publicist and all that. So we put out the press release saying that Jim had died, and everything changed. Suddenly I'm on the phone with Amy Gordon, having long talks, had several detailed, lengthy interviews with Jill and Mike Post, and they all kicked in photographs, and suddenly, they were part of the project. I'm glad to say that although their interviews were excellent and informative and helpful, I had already had the story. There were no missing pieces that they could provide me with. But on the other hand, they were not in the position to know this stuff, oddly enough. What they knew about was what they lived through. But when they read the book, all three of them were blown away. Kind of a life-changing type blown away. I mean, Mike Post called me. He said, I realized that I couldn't have helped Jim any more than I did. And Jill Gordon said the same thing. And to her, she was quite remote from Jim after the divorce, other than the co-parenting, which he was very, very slight on. So she didn't know about any of the torturous things of, like, weeding the backyard or taking down the gold records or any of that. And it absolutely blew her mind. She told me pretty much the same thing, that, she came to realize that she couldn't have helped Jim any more than she did. And of course, Amy Gordon, Jim's daughter, she was so traumatized by the death of her grandmother at age 14 and at the hands of her difficult father, that she was unable to even face it for many, many years. About 10 years ago, she started to, deal with this and arrange for a conservancy for her father, and tried to visit him, and sort of started to think about this in some kind of way. So this book was incredibly important to her, and allowed her to see her father in a more holistic manner. This is deep stuff. I mean, I love getting good reviews and everything, but having those three read the book and tell me that it changed their lives, that's all I need.
there's no upside to this, as Mike Posta told you. I can understand that, but he said that because you can't tell the story without all these big warts. Is that why?
I think, I mean, John, you and I can't really understand that kind of trauma. And it's certainly nothing you ever get over. It's only something you get years away from and make some kind of peace with. But if you're in that blast zone, you're walking away scarred for life. And I don't think Mike or Jill or Amy thought about such a book and the research and the knowledge that it contained would be healing. I don't think they thought that at all. I don't think it even occurred to them. It turned out to be. And I'm in the newspaper business. I've been around traumatized people all my life and tried to get them to answer questions and always at the most vulnerable, wrong time. So I'm not inexperienced with trauma victims, and they're tender people. You have to give them space to be themselves and try and understand their perspective on things. Pressing trauma victims has never been a successful strategy for me.
God only knows. Orange juice bottles. Who would have thought? And you had said that in the other interview, and I heard you say it before. You can't listen to that song. I didn't know what that was. I noticed it. Tell me about that.
Can't hear it any other way now, can you? Yeah, they're just right up in front of the drum kit and prominently in there, and of course that's orange juice bottles. I mean, clip clop, clip clop. What else would do that? It's a perfect combination of Jim Gordon's sort of innate genius and Brian Wilson's kind of childlike, imaginative. Yeah, we can do that.
So he sees him noodling. He sees, what is he? He comes up to him and
goofing around on a break with orange juice bottles, and Brian goes, "Hey, and let's do it." And he took a razor blade and he cut the orange juice bottles so that they would pitch differently. So he had 4 different notes: clip clop, clip clop, clip clop, clip clop. And he kind of follows the Hal Blaine drum pattern. And again, like I say, it's such an important piece in the arrangement. Once you know what that is, you never hear that record the same way.
It's Hal Blaine who suggested Jim Gordon to the Beach Boys.
Hal Blaine gave Jim a lot of work. In 1964, 65, there was just so much recording work in Hollywood. And so it wasn't a super competitive scene with these guys. And they all had the Jim Gordon flash. Here's this 18, 19-year-old guy who played drums in a way that they'd never heard, that they'd never imagined. It's like Bobby Jones, the golfer, when he saw Jack Nicklaus play the first time, he said, "What game he plays, I know not." And that's how Jim was. I mean, Jack Nietzsche saw him, boom, Phil Spector sessions next week. Harold Batiste heard him on Sonny and Cher session, boom, he's in the lineup. Lee Hazelwood, boom, use him on everything. I mean, it's up in the air who played on These Boots Are Made for Walking. Okay? It's really, nobody knows. Hal Blaine thinks he played on it. Jim thinks he played on it. The union contract that I've seen says Frank Clapp played on it. No, not Frank Clapp, Richie Frost. So we don't know who played on it, but there may have been different versions of it. I'm not really sure. But he played on all the Lee Hazelwood records. He played on all the Lenny Waronker records. Lenny was starting producing records at Warner Brothers. So he's on those Harper's Bazaar, Beau Brummels, Randy Newman, Ry Cooder, all that stuff is Jim and Lenny. And Richard Perry picked up on him real quick. So like from 64, 65, people were hearing Jim Gordon for the first time, and they couldn't book enough dates with him. By 66, he's the most famous drummer in town. He's more famous than Hal Blaine at that point.
I was doing this thing on Derek and the Dominos, and I started getting back into the album, which I hadn't really listened to in probably 20 years. And I remember going,
Good
oh
record.
my God, I forgot how, what the hell? I spent 20 years without this record,
A
and
good
loving
record.
it with older, more mature ears. But
Now go back to the live one.
yeah, there's so many memories around that one. Rita Coolidge, I know was, is that when he first, because he had this outburst with Rita Coolidge. Is that
That
the
seems
first time
to be-
people around started seeing that he,
Yeah, they didn't notice it. I mean, psychotic behavior just blended into the background with all that bacchanalia. Nobody really, so what, Yeah, I think that was like the beginning of Jim acting out uncontrollable impulses. Again, the schizophrenic has this turbulent inner life, disturbing thoughts, disturbing feelings, and Jim repressed that stuff powerfully. The people constantly made mention of a real easygoing smile, and a few people noticed it was too easygoing, that it was a place he went to be safe. So Jim really learned how to present himself as this harmless, inoffensive drummer boy. In his inner life, there was much more turbulence than he ever let on. So they would have these fissures that would happen, and the Rita incident was one, and they would continue over the years, growing sort of larger and more dramatic. Outbursts in the studio that people didn't understand, stop it, you're moving my hands, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think the Rita Coolidge thing was sort of the beginning of that. And his inability to have relationships with women was super frustrating to him. And then inevitably sort of ended up with some kind of like violent explosion. So yeah, I mean, it's uncontrollable. That's what the nature of mental illness is. And it is.
I never read Rita Coolidge's book. I've been off and on trying to get her, it's a tough one, to talk. But in her book, she had said that that coda was that she wrote that. What's your take on that at the end of Layla?
Oh, I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. Bobby Whitlock recalls the two of them playing it when he lived in a house with them in the Hollywood Hills. Bonnie Bramlett recalled the two of them playing it on twin grand pianos at Olympic Studios in London during a Delaney and Bonnie session with Clapton there. Rita tells me that she gave Clapton a tape of it. So they finished the album, the Derek and the Dominos album, and they're back in Miami doing some post-production. And Layla's done, but Clapton's not happy with it, and he wants to like do something to elevate the track. And he remembers this piece. And Jim cuts the piano part. He's not a great piano player, but he cuts it. And Whitlock doubles it. They make a composite of that. Tom Dowd calls it the piano exit. And they tack that on to the end. Now, when the record was first released in this country, they put the single out without the piano exit. And it stalled up in the 50s in the charts. And a year and a half later, and I don't know who did this or why, they put the single out again, And the album had come and gone, and it was not a factor. But they put the single out again, this time all 7 minutes with the piano exit. And this time it blows up and is a top 10 hit and reignites the album sale. So Clapton's instincts that the song wasn't quite grand enough were accurate. What he remembered about that piece and how he envisioned it there, I don't know. But I have no doubt that it was that everybody involved knew Rita Coolidge was a co-author and just decided to skip over that part. It had happened to her before. I mean, she and Bonnie Bramlett had written that song "Groupie Superstar," and they played it for Delaney, and he says, "Great," and published it as authored by Delaney, Bramlett, and Leon Russell. I think it was a big hit for the Carpenters.
You know, Bill Bruford told me, and I've got a quote here. He says, Brits are determinately arrhythmic, he said. I said, what? He says, well, you know, some of the best drummers, he loves all American drummers. And but I found that interesting coming from Bill Bruford.
Well, the English guys had such a different approach to things. They didn't have the great tradition of big band jazz and rhythm and blues drumming. They come from much more polite sort of music hall background and light jazz. Guys like Humphrey Littleton, who was a big figure in the so-called trad jazz movement. I mean, it is, holding your sticks like chopsticks and all that. So yeah, I mean, American drumming was a different world to them, and it was the Hollywood guys. I don't want to not mention Gary Chester out in New York, but it was the Hollywood guys, Earl Palmer, Hal Blaine, and Jim Gordon, who really took the drums out of the hands of the Gene Krupa files and made rock and roll drumming a scientific matter.
Yeah, I like that chapter on Gene Krupa and that phase. That because I talk to a lot of drummers, and of course Gene Krupa comes up an awful lot in when we're
I had no idea how important a role Krupa played in designing the modern drum set. That was news to me, and I knew stylistically what he'd done for drums, but that he'd actually designed the cymbals and the kit, and that all was news. But yeah, he was this incredible definitional figure of this modern American instrument, the contraption drum set. And he was the one who constructed the initial vocabulary and created the template for everything that was going to follow. And it was years and years and years before they broke that template.
Early to mid 70s, I remember when I was a big Gordon Lightfoot fan, and I'm watching the back of the album and I'm going, where's Barry Keane? Who's this Jim Gordon guy? And I'm going, oh, wait a minute, I've heard his name before. And that sort of opened up for me the fact of opening up another layer of saying, who is this guy? I keep seeing his name, because all of a sudden Barry's not there. And Barry Keane came back later on, but like Sundown, Carefree Highway. I mean, so I think it was Tony Royster Jr. or it might have been Russ Miller who basically said, If Leaving Me Is Easy by Phil Collins. He had said, If Leaving Me Is Easy by Phil Collins is the hardest songs to play. I'm going, what are you talking about? It's so slow. It's so incredibly slow that it's hard to play. And a lot of people who aren't drummers don't know that. But like Sundown, I look at what he did with that. I'm going, oh my God, I don't think I could have drummed to that song.
So that was the first drum. That was the first track they cut.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Lenny wanted to brighten up the Gordon Lightfoot sound. They'd been working on records together, and they got him sort of out of the obscure bag. If You Could Read My Mind was getting some action, but he wanted to, do something big with. So he brought Jim to Toronto, and as you say, and Gordon Lightfoot had this tight little creative unit around him, and bringing in an outsider was a big deal. And the first night it was a mess, and Lightfoot called Lenny and demanded he fire the drummer, and And Lenny said, just one more night, okay? And Lightfoot said, okay. So they go in the next night, and the first song is Sundown. And Lightfoot has this 12-string part, and Lenny says, lay out on the 2 and 3 so that the 12-string part can be prominently displayed. Oh, no problem. So he lays out, and it just pops, right? It just pops out, and immediately everybody in the studio knows that what they have is going to be a big hit record. And that's Jim's gift. That's what Jim's job was. Jim was there to make this into a hit. 6 days a week in recording studios, 3 sessions a day, 5 songs a session, working with the same like 30 musicians. The level of competence, the level of science, it was surgical type of skill. And the whole dedication was to make this into a hit record. It was not about jazz. It was not about groove. It was not about dance. It was about hit record. And that's what Jim did. And that's him on Sundown.
I know you've got to be someplace. You're having a lunch date, right? I know I make you late for your lunch date.
Prairie Prince.
Oh, what about him?
That's my lunch date.
No way. I love you know what? I love the Tubes. I talked to Fee a little while ago, and of course Todd Rundgren. I love Todd Rundgren. Prairie Prince is one of my. That guy drums like nobody's business. Like, get out of my freaking way. I'm coming through. No way.
He's got a solo album that he's done based on the Ken Nordine record Colors, and I'm gonna have lunch with Prairie and devise his publicity campaign, write his bio or whatever. Prairie Prince is not only one of the greatest drummers of our time, but he's also like one of the coolest people I've ever known.
Okay, so you tell him I have 133,000 subscribers. I want to talk to that guy when the time is right. I want to talk to him.
We'll hook you up.
Good Vibrations, Jim Gordon.
So Good Vibrations was a record that Brian Wilson started during the Pet Sound sessions and did some work on a version of it with different lyrics, and put it away because he realized that the texture was not congruent with the Pet Sound stuff. Once he was done with Pet Sounds, he took it back off the shelf. So this is a track that had like 22 sessions associated with it, $50,000 budget, unheard of at that time. Many musicians, many efforts, many different parts. In the final version is a composite master track. So Hal Blaine is in the first verse and the first chorus. Jim is in the second verse. Hal is back in the chorus. Jim is back in the bridge. Hal is back in the final chorus, and Jim is in all over the outro. So you can tell if you like do the microscopic listening that the drum parts shift attitude and approach during those parts. And especially on the outro, you can really feel Jim. One of the Jim Gordon trademark was the boil. You know what I mean? That after the one, there was a little bit of a bubble, a little bit of a boil, and then we'd get to the 4. It wasn't necessarily on the 2 and 3. And that boil had its own sort of fingerprint. It moved around. It was what he applied to that spot. So you can hear the boil very clearly on the outro of Good Vibrations, and it was perfect for what it was supposed to do.
I asked Bernie Ledden a couple of years ago, I says, what do you think Hotel California would have sounded like if you'd stayed in the band? And he says, well, that's a cute question. He says, that's a cute question. But he says, Pretty Maids All in a Row. I love that song. He said, how about that? I did listen to the album. But this is one of those questions. I'll leave you with this. hypothetical, where you think he'd be without that mental illness? Let's just say it didn't overpower him. You think he'd still be doing it? I mean, I know that's a pie in the sky question, but
So look, clearly Jim's mental illness goes way back, and the drums were a refuge from it early on. And the unbelievable ability and the incredible devotion to that is born of a motivation of trying to escape these terrible feelings. So we can't really separate we can't parse those things in this case. Then also, it's really clear that of all the spectrum that schizophrenia occurs on, Jim was at the far, far end. The command hallucinations were totally severe. His brain chemistry was just a mess, and he was not going to be able to be treated. I mean, to this day, half the diagnosed schizophrenics do not respond to treatment. Half of them. So Jim at the far end, I don't think there was going to be any bringing Jim back from his mental illness. And I think that the period of time, the 15 years that he was working in the studios, that was the disease under control enough that he could function. And of course, that's why none of the psychiatrists diagnosed him as schizophrenic. And he saw many, many, many psychiatrists. He went into many, many residential treatment programs.
He was only diagnosed after, right? After
the crime, he was diagnosed as schizophrenic. But before that, it was mood disorder. It was depressive. He was too high functioning for the psychiatrists to believe that he was as severely mentally ill as he was.
Who surprised you the most when you interviewed them? Who was the biggest surprise of anyone you've interviewed?
Sam the Sham.
Why?
His name's Sam Samudio, and he had an album out called Sam Hard and Heavy, and he did a promo tour. This would be about 72, 73, and he was with a promo man named Mario Medios, who was known as the Magnificent M. And these two guys showed up in town at a hotel room, and I went over to do a little newspaper article. And I was unprepared for the caliber of characters that I was meeting up with. The Super M was just incredible, and Sam was an amazing guy. He was funny, he was smart, he was talented. He got it, and he told me that the second time he went to Nashville, he drove up from Texas and he parked his car and he reached around and started to pull his guitar out of the back seat. And he heard somebody laugh. And he looked across the street and there was a guy in the back of a garbage truck up to his waist in garbage laughing at him. And he said, I took one look at that and I put the guitar back and went home to Texas.
Anyway, have a really nice lunch. I'm glad we know each other. I hope we can talk again. Hey, man, I really appreciate it. Great book. Nice job.
Thanks for your interest. This is a real important book to me. I came to really care deeply about Jim, and he received such little understanding and compassion during his lifetime. It really is important to me to see that he gets a measure of it at this stage.
Yeah.
And that was the goal.
Well,
so thanks for the time and thanks for the interest, and anytime, let's do it again.
Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Make sure you comment on our videos, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos. If you want to make a donation to the channel, there's a PayPal link. Also, join our Patreon. You'll get early access to our videos. And we have a swag store where you can buy a Rock History Music t-shirt, cap, and all kinds of different swag with our logo on it. Subscribe to our channel, share our videos, and comment on them. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Music. Take care of yourself.